The lights of the studio burned hot, casting long shadows across a set charged with tension. Cameras rolled, every lens focused on Donald Trump, who was mid-rant. His voice boomed, a cascade of insults and half-truths, the kind of bluster he had mastered over decades. The audience watched with a mix of unease and fascination, as though bracing for yet another storm of noise without substance. He leaned into the microphone, his hands slicing the air, his tone dripping with the certainty that no one would dare stop him. But then, Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the room. Like a razor, calm, sharp, unflinching. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. With a steady look and a single breath, she began dismantling the mountain of arrogance before her. For 23 seconds, she spoke with the kind of precision that doesn't just answer, it demolishes. Each phrase struck like a hammer on glass, exposing cracks in the facade Trump had built. The studio changed instantly. The murmurs stopped. The audience leaned in. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Trump blinked, his expression faltering as if he had been hit by something he could not name. His words dried up, caught between disbelief and fury. Red crept across his face as his body language shifted from commanding to cornered. For the first time that evening, he was not the master of the stage. He was the target. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need applause to validate her. Her truth stood taller than any insult. Her composure brighter than the glare of those studio lights. By the time her final words fell, the room was frozen in awe. 23 seconds. That was all it took. Trump tried to respond, fumbling for a retort, but his usual tricks failed him. The audience wasn't buying it. The silence pressed harder than any boo. And then, in a flash of anger and humiliation, he pushed away from the desk, muttering, shaking his head, and stormed off the set. The cameras kept rolling. The nation kept watching. And in that instant, something bigger than a studio debate was born. But what led to this moment, and why it struck the country, like lightning, was a story far larger than one man's retreat. What unfolded in that studio wasn't just another viral moment in America's endless cycle of political theater. It was something deeper, sharper, and far more consequential, because when Jasmine Crockett rose to speak, she wasn't simply sparring with a man, known for insults and sound bites. She was striking at the very heart of what this country stands for. The stakes weren't confined to the glare of the studio, lights, or the roar of television ratings. They stretched into the soul of a nation already divided, already weary from years of shouting, scandals, and spectacle. Trump's words weren't just noise. They were symbols of a style of politics built on distraction, distortion, and domination. And in that moment, Crockett's voice carried more than her own truth. It carried the weight of millions, who had been told to stay quiet, to know their place, to shrink beneath the shadow of louder men. Every line of Trump's rant was designed to reinforce an old hierarchy, might makes right. Volume equals victory, and truth is whatever he declares it to be. For too long, this formula had worked. It had bulldozed over reason and rewritten reality. But Crockett's 23-second dismantling of his narrative reminded the world that power rooted in arrogance is fragile. That truth, when spoken with clarity, has the force to pierce through even the thickest walls of noise. This wasn't just about Trump losing control in a television studio. It was about a country watching, in real time, the crumbling of a myth, that intimidation could silence everyone, that bluster could drown out dignity. Crockett's calm defiance became a mirror held up to America. Do we want a politics of spectacle, or a politics of substance? Do we want leaders who shout, or leaders who serve? And for millions, especially those who had ever felt dismissed or underestimated, her words were more than a clapback. They were validation, proof that arrogance can be confronted and beaten, not with louder noise, but with sharper truth. Crockett didn't just dismantle Trump's argument. She exposed the weakness behind the swagger, the hollowness beneath the bravado. The ripple effect was immediate. Viewers didn't just see a clash of personalities, they saw a clash of values. And in that contrast, the stakes of the confrontation became undeniable. Truth versus deception, dignity versus arrogance, democracy versus demagoguery. Crockett's moment wasn't just about scoring points in a debate. It was about reminding America that its soul is not defined by who shouts the loudest, but by who stands tallest when the shouting ends. And so, as Trump stormed off the stage, red-faced and rattled, the country was left asking itself, what does it mean? When truth finally cuts through the noise? What happens when the mighty are humbled, not by power, but by principle? The answer begins by looking closer at the man she faced. his history, his habits, and the very contradictions that made this takedown inevitable. To understand why her words landed so hard, we have to first look at the man she was up against. To understand the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words, you have to understand the man who stood across from her, the man whose entire career was built on noise, intimidation, and the illusion of invincibility. Donald Trump has always fashioned himself as untouchable, a figure too loud, too brash, too unyielding to be cornered, and for years that act seemed to work. From the gilded towers of Manhattan to the political stages of Washington, Trump honed a style of dominance that relied less on reason and more on sheer force. He learned early that if you talked long enough, shouted loud enough, and repeated your words, truth became negotiable. The only constant was Trump's certainty that he alone controlled the room. His rallies were choreographed spectacles of this strategy. The insults hurled at opponents, the jeers directed at reporters, the bombast about winning and power, all of it, was designed to project an image of unstoppable strength. And for those who opposed him, the lesson was clear. Argue with him and you'll be buried in a flood of nicknames, interruptions, and relentless attacks. It was this same strategy he brought into that studio on the night. Jasmine Crockett faced him. Trump believed the formula would hold. He'd overwhelm, he'd intimidate, he'd suck the oxygen out of the room until no one else could breathe, let alone speak. It was a style that had toppled senators, rattled governors, and turned debates into circuses where truth was the clown. But behind the veneer of invincibility was a man deeply dependent on that formula. Strip away the noise and the contradictions spilled out. A self-proclaimed champion of the forgotten man who lived a life of privilege. A fighter for law and order who dodged accountability whenever it knocked on his door. A defender of democracy who undermined it when the results no longer suited him. These contradictions weren't just personal, they were political weapons, sharpened into slogans and hurled like darts at any who dared question him. And yet, for all the bravado, there was one unspoken truth. Trump had rarely been forced into silence, rarely been confronted calmly and surgically in a way he couldn't shout over. His power thrived on chaos, and in chaos, he almost always found victory. But chaos has a limit. And when the noise meets someone unwilling to flinch, someone armed not with volume, but with clarity, the performance begins to crack. That was the stage Jasmine Crockett stepped onto. She wasn't blinded by the gold-plated mythology. She wasn't rattled by the raised voice or the swinging insults. She had seen bluster before, and she had dismantled it before. So when she spoke, she wasn't just answering Trump, she was exposing him. Every line she delivered in those 23 seconds pointed back to this history. A man who built an empire on domination, now standing naked before truth. For once, his rhythm was broken. The old tricks, interrupt, insult over power, failed him. And the image of invincibility that had carried him for so long shattered in front of millions. That's why the moment mattered. It wasn't simply one politician correcting another. It was a rare and stunning crack in a persona built to look unbreakable. And that's why people couldn't look away. Trump had faced senators, governors, journalists, and world leaders. But this time was different. This time, the calm precision of a single voice revealed what years of shouting had tried to hide. Beneath the volume, the swagger, the endless barrage of words, was a man terrified of being exposed. And Jasmine Crockett had just done the exposing. But while Trump's past was paved with contradictions and arrogance, Crockett's path told a very different story, a story rooted not in bluster, but in resilience, service, and truth. And that is where the true drama begins. Jasmine Crockett did not rise to this moment by accident. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had walked through fire and refused to be consumed by it. Long before she ever faced Trump under studio lights, she was shaped by a story of struggle, grit, and an unwavering belief that truth matters, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is dangerous, even when it comes at a personal cost. Her path began far from the gilded stages of American politics. Born and raised in a community where opportunities were often scarce and voices, like hers, were too often silenced, Crockett learned early that the world would not hand her respect. She would have to claim it. And she did. First through education, then through relentless service. Law became her weapon, not for personal gain, but to shield those who had no armor against systems that dismissed them. She defended the vulnerable, the unheard, the unseen. In every case, in every courtroom, she sharpened her skills, not only as an attorney, but as a fighter who could not be intimidated by titles or wealth. Her journey proved one thing: leaders are not made in towers or through inherited wealth. They are forged in struggle, sharpened by service, and defined by how they respond when the lights burn brightest. Jasmine Crockett's story was proof of that truth. And on that night, her entire life became the prelude to a single, unshakable moment of triumph. But the showdown was only just beginning. Because when two paths so different collided under the hot lights of that studio, the sparks didn't just light up the stage, they ignited the kind of confrontation America would never forget. The studio had already tasted sparks, but now the fire was spreading. Trump, still seething from moments before, leaned forward with the restless energy of a man determined to regain control. His voice thundered through the microphones, bouncing off the walls, louder with every interruption. He called her names, cut across her answers, and gestured wildly at the moderators as though the rules of time and fairness didn't apply to him. For Trump, the show was always his to command, or so he thought. Jasmine Crockett sat steady, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't take the bait, didn't flinch when he raised his voice so high it rattled the soundboard. She let him spend his energy. She let him show his hand. And with every outburst, with every insult hurled across the table, the balance of power shifted. The crowd felt it. The cameras caught it. The tension in the room grew thick, almost unbearable. Each time Crockett opened her mouth to respond, Trump would barrel through, raising his tone, desperate to reclaim the dominance that had slipped through his fingers. But Crockett never once raised her voice. Her silence between his interruptions became its own kind of weapon. Each pause was heavier than his tirades, each measured glance reminding viewers that dignity doesn't need to shout. She was waiting, not passively but deliberately, waiting for the moment when his noise collapsed under its own weight. And then it happened. Trump's rant reached a fever pitch, his words tumbling over themselves. His face flushed red under the lights. He leaned so far forward he nearly toppled the microphone. His hands flailed, his voice cracked with fury, and for the first time, the aura of control he had carried into the room seemed to break. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of victory. It was the silence of expectation. Everyone, audience, moderators, millions watching at home, leaned in at once. This was the opening Crockett had been waiting for. Her lips parted, her gaze steady, her tone calm yet cutting. She began to speak, and with her first words, the tension in the studio shifted from chaos to suspense. Because the next 23 seconds would change everything. The studio had fallen into a breathless stillness, as if the entire room knew a decisive moment was about to unfold. Trump had ranted himself into exhaustion, his voice cracking, his face glowing red beneath the studio lights. The audience was restless, moderators unsure how to wrestle back control. But Jasmine Crockett didn't need control handed to her. She created it. She leaned into her microphone, her voice low and measured, cutting through the noise like glass against stone. "You know what the difference between us is, Mr. Trump?" She began, her tone calm but laced with steel. The audience leaned forward, a hush washing over them. For the first time all night, Trump went silent. Her words landed in sharp, deliberate beats. "You spent years shouting, tearing people down, making this country smaller with every insult you throw. I've spent my life lifting people up, fighting, for those who never had a voice in rooms like this." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Trump's eyes narrowed, his jaw working, but he didn't interrupt. Crockett had found the rarest thing in the world, his silence. The cameras caught it, the flicker of unease on Trump's face. His bluster had met a wall it couldn't shake. Crockett didn't stop. Her voice grew brighter, heavier with truth. "You said America was yours. But I'm here to remind you, America belongs to all of us. The immigrants you sneer at, the workers you exploit, the women you dismiss. We are this nation, and we are not leaving." The crowd erupted, applause breaking like thunder. The moderators raised their hands for order, but the energy was unstoppable. On social media, clips were already being posted. Captions flying, "Crockett shatters Trump in 23 seconds. Trump shifted uncomfortably, searching for a response. But his usual arsenal, mockery, volume, bravado had been stripped from him. He opened his mouth, stammered, closed it again. The cameras zoomed in mercilessly on his reddened face, his lips pressed into a tight line. Crockett's final blow came sharp and unforgettable. "So, if you can't handle one woman standing up to you in this studio, how on earth did you ever think you could handle leading? A country built on courage?" The studio detonated in applause. The moderators struggled to contain the chaos, but the image was already seared into history. Trump frozen, cornered, crumbling under the weight of her words. And then, in an instant of raw, unfiltered defeat, he did what no one expected. He shoved back his chair, muttered something inaudible, and stormed off the stage. The camera panned desperately, catching the back of his head as he fled the studio, leaving the microphone swinging. The sound of his footsteps faded, replaced by the roar of an audience that knew it had just witnessed something bigger than a debate. Crockett didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply sat back, her composure unshaken, as though she had known all along this would be the outcome. In those 23 seconds, dignity had defeated arrogance. Calm had destroyed chaos. And for millions watching, it wasn't just a debate, it was a declaration. But the true impact of that mic drop moment wouldn't be measured in applause or headlines alone. It was only beginning. Because once Trump walked off that stage, the aftershocks traveled farther and faster than anyone imagined. The echoes of Trump's footsteps had barely faded when the first ripple hit. Phones across the studio lit up instantly. Journalists firing off tweets, staffers fumbling to capture every angle, audience members pushing shaky clips to TikTok and Instagram. By the time Trump's SUV pulled away from the building, the internet had already crowned the night's victor. Jasmine Crockett destroys Trump in 23 seconds. Blared the first viral headline. Within minutes, hashtags surged to the top of Twitter's trending list. Kurt Crockett 23 seconds. Trump storms off, your mic drop moment. Millions who hadn't tuned in live were suddenly flooding to watch the clip, replaying it on loop, marveling at the calm precision with which Crockett had dismantled a man who built his brand on chaos. Cable news scrambled to catch up. Some anchors shook their heads in disbelief, marveling at how a freshman congresswoman had cornered a former president. Others, predictably, rushed to excuse Trump's exit as fatigue or unfair moderation. But the footage was undeniable. His face red with frustration, his voice breaking into stammers, his walk-off abrupt and humiliating. No spin could erase the optics. For Crockett's supporters, the moment was electric. Communities that had long felt dismissed or diminished saw themselves, reflected in her poise. Immigrant families replayed her line, "America belongs to all of us," as though it had been spoken directly into their living rooms. Young women shared clips with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully." Activists quoted her as proof that truth, when delivered without fear, could still pierce the loudest lies. But not everyone was celebrating. Conservative outlets fumed, accusing Crockett of disrespect, claiming the moderators had let her ambush Trump. Right-wing pundits flooded primetime with excuses, but their outrage only amplified the moment further. Each attempt to downplay it kept it alive, replayed, reframed, and reshared. For now, though, the night belonged to Crockett. 23 seconds had shaken the political landscape, rewritten the debate narrative, and given millions a glimpse of what it looked like when truth stood unafraid. And yet the story was far from over. Because to understand how one moment could ripple so powerfully across the country, we had to look at the broader stage on which it was playing out, the battle for America's very soul. What unfolded in that studio was more than a clash of personalities. It was a parable for the nation itself, played out under hot lights and live cameras. On one side stood Donald Trump, embodying the politics of spectacle, loud, brash, unyielding, feeding off fear and division. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, calm, poised, a voice of clarity rooted in the lived reality of those who had long been sidelined. Their confrontation was not just debate theater. It was a collision of two Americas. For Trump, politics had always been about domination. Speak the loudest, interrupt the most, make every stage your own. His strategy thrived on drowning out nuance with sheer volume. But Crockett represented the antidote. Her power was not in outshouting, but in outlasting. Not in fire, but in steadiness. Not in bluster, but in truth. Her words cut through the noise precisely because they came without theatrics. When she declared, "America belongs to all of us," she was not just responding to a rant. She was summoning the memory of generations who had fought, struggled, and bled to carve out their place in this country. Immigrants who arrived with nothing but faith. Black communities who endured centuries of exclusion and built culture out of resilience. Women who had been told to sit down and stay quiet, yet stood anyway. Trump's storm-off wasn't just a personal defeat. It symbolized the unraveling of a politics that treats power as a performance. His exit revealed the limits of intimidation when confronted with unwavering dignity, and that symbolism resonated far beyond the studio. For many watching, Crockett embodied that choice. She didn't just represent political resistance, she represented possibility, a vision of politics rooted in respect, in resilience, in the idea that everyone has a place in the story of America. But symbolism is never static. For Trump's supporters, the moment was framed as betrayal, an insult to the America they imagined themselves defending. Yet symbolism alone doesn't change history. For it to matter, it had to be carried forward into movements, into ballots, into the future. And that responsibility didn't just fall on Crockett's shoulders. The stage was set, the symbolism was clear, but the battle was far from over. Because every symbol, no matter how powerful, must eventually face the test of reality. And as the shockwaves of that night spread, the question became, would America rise to meet the moment, or retreat into the chaos from which it came? The clip ended, but the echoes did not. Across living rooms, phones, and laptops, viewers sat stunned, some in disbelief, others in elation. What they had just witnessed wasn't merely a debate gone off the rails. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't insulted, hadn't played the game on Trump's terms, and yet she won. In 23 seconds, she had revealed the hollowness of his performance, showing that power without substance crumbles when confronted with truth. Her restraint had become her weapon, her clarity the antidote to chaos. And Trump? His storming exit wasn't just dramatic, it was symbolic. For years, he had built his persona on the idea that he could outlast, outtalk, outbully anyone. But when faced with a woman who refused to bend, who looked him in the eye and calmly stripped away the bluster, he fled. The emperor, as the saying goes, had no clothes. And everyone saw it. For progressives, the moment was fuel. In a landscape where outrage fatigue had dulled even the sharpest scandals, Crockett's composure reignited something. Pride, validation, a reminder that courage can come dressed in calm. Immigrants saw in her words the affirmation of belonging. Women saw in her stance the rebuke of centuries of silencing. Communities long dismissed as too angry or too radical saw themselves reflected in her balance of fire and grace. The crescendo wasn't just about one night or one confrontation. It was about what comes next. Because Crockett's 23 seconds could not live only as a viral clip, they had to become a rallying cry. The symbolism had to transform into strategy, into organizing, into votes, into a refusal to be drowned out ever again. Still, there was an undeniable sweetness to the moment. For once, the bully had been silenced, not with anger, but with truth. For once, the stage had belonged to someone who represented the America so often pushed to the margins. And for once, millions of viewers who had grown weary of shouting matches and scandals could feel, if only briefly, that dignity had triumphed. As the lights dimmed and the headlines spread, one truth lingered in the air: 23 seconds can change everything. Crockett hadn't just dismantled Trump's rant. She had offered a glimpse of an America still worth fighting for, an America where leadership is measured not by noise, but by clarity, courage, and conviction. And as the credits rolled on that night's broadcast, the story was only beginning.